Hi, Mrs. KJ here. We're going to go over part 2 of the 1.14 life science lesson. Multicellular specialization. So multicellular, organisms with more than one cell like you, specialization, how each cell does a different job. A multicellular organism begins as a single cell that divides into a group of identical cells. In the early stages of the organism's development, the cells are identical to each other. So we'll go ahead and take a look at this. And here we have a single cell that's going to be a tadpole. And you can see that the cell divides in half. So now we have 2 cells. They both divide in half, so we have 4 cells. Now how many? 8. And it keeps going like that. Eventually, once the cells split enough, certain cells will develop into different kind of cells. Like some will be neurons, some will be blood cells. But when they start out, they're all exactly the same. Many tiny cells. Many multicellular organisms are microscopic. Even though they are too small to see without a microscope, they have many cells with different functions, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. They're microscopic and they still are made of multiple cells. A gastrotrich is an example of a microscopic multicellular organism with enough cells for a digestive and nervous system. Here we can see a bunch of pond creatures, and this large one here is our gastrotrich, and a lot of the other ones around it are single cells. You can see in comparison how much larger the gastrotrich is. It's pretty crazy to think of all that going on in pond and lake water that you can't even see. Giant organisms. One example of a multicellular organism from the kingdom Protista is a giant kelp. Like most multicellular organisms, giant kelp contains groups of cells forming particular structures. Each structure performs one or more unique job or function. Holdfast is a structure in giant kelp that attaches to rocky bottoms and prevents the organism from being washed away. So like you have hands, they have a part of them called a holdfast to hang on. Another important structure of the giant kelp is the gas bladder. The gas bladder keeps the giant kelp floating in an upright position, which allows it to receive sunlight. So in other words, it traps that air which can float in the water and keeps the kelp at the surface. Picture didn't show up, so I just Googled some. Here you can see some giant kelp to really get a big idea of how big it is, along with the gas bubbles that look like little pods that help them float. So over the last 2 slides, we talked about very small and very large multicellular organisms. Now, I'm sure you knew multicellular organisms could be big, right? Like you can probably think of what are some large animals. Elephants, the blue whale, okay? But you might not have realized that some are microscopic. So I'd add that to the note. So some multicellular organisms are microscopic. So here we have our picture of giant kelp fronds in fast-flowing currents. So when you watch how fast the water is going by and how much rippling action is happening all over, you can see why the kelp would need a hold-fast structure in order to hold fast, hold on to the rocks to keep it from being taken away by the currents. Banyan trees. The banyan tree is an example of a multicellular organism from the kingdom Plantae. In other words, it's a plant. As a banyan tree develops, many cells differentiate to form roots. Roots are structures that collect nutrients and water for a plant. Roots also hold down the part of the plant that is above the ground. The banyan tree is unusual because it has roots that come down from its branches and reach the ground. These are called aerial roots, aerial as in air, and they provide additional support and collect more nutrients, allowing the banyan trees to become very large. There are some characteristics of multicellular organisms that distinguish them from unicellular ones. Do you remember those unique characteristics? So you should hit pause, and if you don't remember them, you should probably go back and check your notes on unicellular. So here, if we look at a banyan tree, they grow in Hawaii, they grow down south. We don't have them here in Minnesota, but the trunk of the tree is back right where the mouse is right here. And these are all the roots coming down. They're pretty crazy, and they get huge. There's entire parks that will have like one banyan tree in the whole park. Okay, so here we have a graphic organizer, multicellular organisms, talking about growth. Multicellular organisms begin as a single cell To grow, the single cell divides into many cells. Specialization. As a multicellular organism grows, the cells begin to differentiate. The cells become specialized. Different functions. Similar cells group together to perform a certain job of that organism. The group of similar cells is not an organism because they have only one job. So for example, all of your blood cells would be working together, but their blood cells aren't an organism, they're just part of the organism. And large size. The different groups of cells combine to form one organism that can perform all of the functions of the organism. Pause as I typed up this next sentence because I wanted to think about it for a little bit. And if you want, you can copy on this chart. Otherwise, I made the chart into this paragraph here. So multicellular again, start as a single cell that divides into many cells that become the different kinds of specialized cells. Similar cells group together to do a job, like blood, but it takes many different groups to make an actual organism. So go ahead and hit pause and either copy down this or go here and copy down these two, and then pause again and copy down these two, whichever you prefer. Advantages of being multicellular. Organisms with many types of cells have some advantages over unicellular organisms. Single-celled organisms have to perform all the functions necessary for life in one cell. Multicellular organisms can perform more functions because specific functions can be done by different cells. This also means multicellular organisms can be larger. Of course, generally, the larger an organism is, the more food it needs to stay healthy. It also needs increased structural support, such as a skeleton provides. But multicellular organisms are able to use some of the cells to obtain food and others to provide support. So just some examples of some multicellular organisms. So let's check our chart. Did we include all that already? All right, we talked about the fact that it can store energy if you're multicellular, that if you're bigger, you can do more, but bigger as a disadvantage also means that you need more food. And you can perform more functions because there's more to you, right? You have a skeleton to support you to run in that versus like those single-celled organisms in the pond that we watched earlier could just swim around. So different cells can do different jobs. All right, so we got that in our notes. Sponges. The sea is filled with multicellular organisms that use specialized cells to their advantage. One example is a sponge. A sponge is in the kingdom Animalia and uses different types of cells for different organisms. Sponges have collar cells that pump water into the sponge's body. The water contains oxygen and nutrients for the sponge to use for energy. Other cells absorb and dispense food to the rest of the body. The tubular nature of sponges is clearly seen here. So you can see that they're the tubes. They can pump the water in and get rid of their waste. Notice the large open mouth or osculum at the top of each tube. Cells in the sponge that absorb and dispense food to the rest of the body are called amoebocytes. Just a fun fact, you don't need to know that. Disadvantages of being multicellular. Multicellular organisms are not always at an advantage over single-celled organisms. Groups of specialized cells in multicellular organisms depend on each other if they perform different functions. If one group of cells does not operate normally, then another group might be affected and will not be able to perform its function. Consequently, the entire organism may be put at risk. For example, red blood cells carry oxygen throughout your body. These cells rely on your lungs to bring in oxygen from the air. If the lung cells are unable to take in oxygen, your blood cells do not have any oxygen to carry, and your body will lack oxygen required for important life processes. How long do you think you could survive without oxygen? Not long. So a disadvantage of being multicellular, if one part, like the lungs, doesn't perform correctly, the entire organism is at risk. All right, so I don't feel like we had that one really added in our notes. I'm going to add a tab here, and this was a disadvantage, and we can write something that cell groups depend on other cell groups. And then we can put an example here. If your lungs aren't working, your blood doesn't have oxygen to move to other parts of your body. So go ahead and add that to your notes. It's not easy being multicellular. As with everything, there are advantages and disadvantages to being multicellular. Which of these is an advantage and which is not? So, having specialized cells to perform functions, which one is it? All right, so it's an advantage. Needs more food to stay healthy. Is that a disadvantage or an advantage? So hit pause. What's your answer? It's a disadvantage. That means you have to spend time hunting or cooking if you're human. Groups of cells might not function properly. Advantage or disadvantage? Well, like we said, if let's say you break your leg, it's going to impact other parts of your body as well. You wouldn't be able to, if you were a tiger, you wouldn't be able to hunt for food. Able to use cells to store energy. Advantage or disadvantage? So the good thing is that we don't have to be eating constantly. Our cells, our fat cells, are able to store energy. Able to grow to a large size. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage? And that is an advantage, especially if you're like the great white shark, the largest one around. I would say that's definitely an advantage to being something smaller that's going to get eaten. Requires structural support. Is that a disadvantage or an advantage? That's a disadvantage because if you require structural support, that means your body has to grow those structures. That means your body has to take time to grow bones and muscles. Cells are not able to survive on their own. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage? Cells are not able to survive on their own is a disadvantage. So in other words, your blood, once it's out of your body, that's it. All right, so if you want to go into this and try it, it built a roller coaster that you can see and you can do yourself. Organization of multicellular organisms. Individual cells cannot carry out all the life processes for a multicellular organism. Many multicellular organisms are large and need complex systems to respond to their environment. Specialized cells with similar functions can be grouped together to form structures that are capable of carrying out various processes more effectively and efficiently. Most multicellular organisms have 4 levels of organization. The simplest level is a cell, followed by tissue, organ, and organ systems. A group of cells that perform similar functions forms a tissue. A collection of tissues that forms a specialized function is an organ. Organs with similar or related functions are grouped into an organ system. The human body has several major organ systems, including the respiratory system, circulatory system, and digestive systems. So cells, white blood cells make up part of the circulatory system. Tissues. Individual muscle cells work together to form muscle tissue. Organs. The heart is an organ composed of many different tissues. Systems. All of our body systems are made up of different kinds of organs. All right, so let's start a new line here. And this is something that comes up a lot in biology. The fact that you go from cells to tissues to organs to organ systems. Like sometimes there's things that you learn now which might come up again when you take biology your sophomore year, but this is one that will definitely come up. Cells that are alike work together to make tissues. Tissues that are alike work together to make an organ. Organs together make an organ system. My time runs out. We'll have to start part 3. Here's the last sentence you should add to your note. Cells that are alike will make tissues, like muscle tissues, which go together to make your heart. Your heart with vessels make the circulatory system. So just an example of that cells to tissues to organ systems. And we'll finish up in part 3.